Hey everyone! So I got myself a 5070 Ti, mainly because
the biggest strength NVIDIA has is CUDA. Doesn't really matter, we're in for the 4090s or the 3090s or whatever.
and I immediately started to play the best game of all time. It's called I'm a tech person that cannot stop working, so instead of playing games I spent 3 days setting up monitoring with Prometheus, Home Assistant and Grafana for my Windows PC. But before I elaborate on that, I wanted to share some things I've noticed outright when I first installed the GPU in my PC. So above all, no missing ROMs, thankfully. I have run into some issue where if I play a game and then have a picture-in-picture of YouTube video playing, then I've noticed that the YouTube video tends to stop playing. Stop playing as in the video freezes, but the audio is still playing. So I'm pretty sure this has been fixed with a recent driver upgrade, but if you have encountered that, know that you are not alone. The supplied power cables with the GPU are not flexible enough to allow me to close the chassis of my enclosure. I don't know why I was under the impression that all of the 50 series GPUs will have angled power connector for the 12 volts high power. Sadly, the adapter supplied with the card isn't flexible enough to allow me to safely close the...
It's called a case, you idiot.
So I got a dedicated 12 volt high power cable from the producer of my PSU, and I will see if that will be enough. Also, the GPU I got, which is to be exact Asus 5070 Ti Prime, is slightly smaller than other models of other vendors. By smaller I mean it's 5 centimeters shorter and 2 centimeters slimmer, something like that. It is a very small difference between other cards, but I've noticed that it might matter when I will be putting it into my fractal case, which isn't XL. Seeing how I got some problems with 12 volt high power, I might change my NOR fractal to XL. For now, we'll see how that goes, but I would highly recommend you check the GPU dimensions before you put even 5070 into your case. If you've seen my previous video where I was showing how to deploy a Whisper AI locally on your system, I've tried to recreate that with the new GPU just to see how much faster is it with 5070 Ti. It turned out that PyTorch or Torch isn't quite yet ready for the Blackwell architecture from NVIDIA. By not yet ready, I want to say that it is not included in the stable releases of Torch, so if you want to continue using projects that depend on it, you need to install the latest nightly or developer version, which is surprising to me because Blackwell hasn't been released with the 5070 cards. I think the B200s have been on the market in the data center sector for at least a year now. So it's quite puzzling as to why it is not yet included in mainstream Torch releases. Oh yeah, other thing, there was no GPU stand in the GPU package, which I thought was weird. I was thinking that this will be included in all of those 5070 Ti GPUs because, you know, they tend to be quite big and heavy. It's bigger than my previous GPU, definitely. Currently I have no GPU stand, we'll see how that goes. It seems to be fine and it's not really sagging, everything seems to be reinforced. For now, just so you know. And finally, one of the most interesting features of NVIDIA Broadcast is extremely broken on I want to say lower tier GPUs, the Spotlight AI feature. This could be super cool if it weren't for it utilizing almost 100% of your GPU, to the point where just turning it on creates a warning in the NVIDIA Broadcasting app that GPU is overutilized, please close everything else, right? So absolutely no gaming when that's turned on. I think this is the most interesting feature, but sadly the horrid GPU utilization it requires to just, you know, give beta enlightening to a subject is just not worth it at the moment. Okay, so those were the quick bits I just noticed when I installed the GPU, and now I'll just give you a TLDR of my monitoring setup. So basically, I'm using Open Hardware Monitor to collect metrics from my Windows setup and expose them via HTTP server included in the Open Hardware Monitor. From that, the Home Assistant is collecting those metrics via its plugin for the Open Hardware Monitor. Home Assistant is also responsible for collecting the data from other stuff I have at my home, like Zigbee outlets, which gives me complete readings on not only my PC but also the power usage, etc. Finally, Prometheus is pulling Home Assistant at given intervals in order to save everything in a, I want to say, semi-persistent database. I mean semi-persistent because by default Prometheus I think has 2 weeks rotation period on the data. We'll talk more about that later. But just so you know, at the very end, Grafana is connected to Prometheus, and from Grafana I am configuring my dashboards that I'm using to check the performance of my system. So I guess some of you might ask yourself, why is this so complicated? Why so many steps in between? Well, this is where the 3 days of labor come from. I've already had Home Assistant instance running in my server rack, and it already was collecting some info from Zigbee outlets or temperature meters. But I was looking for some method to store the data persistently, and I really wanted to have Grafana as my presentation layer. From Home Assistant, it was really simple to export metrics to Prometheus. I've also tested TimescaleDB and Influx, but those are a bit more a pain in the ass when it comes to configuring dashboards in Grafana. I already have some not so good experiences with Influx, and that dates back I think to a few years back whenever I was doing my side project where I was collecting all of the data from World of Warcraft auction house. I was calculating the metrics and pushing everything into InfluxDB, so I already know the points where InfluxDB tends to be hard to maintain. So I wanted to try the TimescaleDB, and with TimescaleDB the problem was that integrating the TimescaleDB with Home Assistant isn't as simple as integrating Home Assistant with either Influx or Prometheus. I have also run into a problem where if I started saving too many points at the time to TimescaleDB, the plugin for some reason couldn't keep up and it was exiting or just, hanging, and after like 2 or 3 minutes, no data points were being saved to the database. And that was completely a no-go for me. So now I know that TimescaleDB integration with Home Assistant is not really good. I also knew that I really didn't want InfluxDB and I was kinda interested in Prometheus. So I've configured Home Assistant with Prometheus to expose some metrics and my Prometheus instance to pull those metrics. And it turned out that it works flawlessly, almost right from the box. I can configure my Prometheus instance to pull Home Assistant as often as I want it to. The problem with that is that I can't really configure Home Assistant to pull other data points in my network as often as I would like to. For example, Open Hardware Monitor plugin in Home Assistant can only pull my PC for data every 15 seconds. It can be changed if I dig into the code, but it is not a parameter that I would like to set in Home Assistant. Same goes for Zigbee. This is not really a problem because in theory Zigbee is only sending the data whenever it detects change, but if you are plotting your power usage across your power meter versus, let's say, your CPU or GPU utilization, you don't really have a consistent data point when it comes to your CPU utilization and the wattage being pulled from your outlet, right? If you are doing that via Prometheus, it is pulling the Home Assistant at once. So whenever it's saving points to its own database, you have a consistent data point for everything that's being read from Home Assistant in that moment of time. And it is super handy whenever you want to calculate, I don't know, some averages and stuff like that, because you have well-defined time spans and frequencies, and you don't really have to fill in the void points using averages or interpolation or stuff like that. One last thing might be, why am I using Open Hardware Monitor and not HWinfo or HVinfo, whatever it's called? There are 2 reasons why I'm not using HWinfo. First is that in its free version, the shared memory option, which allows other plugins to read the data and expose it to, let's say, Prometheus, is only active for 12 hours. After that time period, it resets itself to being turned off. And secondly, the plugin that allows HWinfo to expose its data to Prometheus using Prometheus Exporter seems to be abandoned. And that seems to be a common subject across all of the Prometheus Exporter for Windows, I think. A lot of those projects or plugins seem to be abandoned, right? Or they work in a weirdly fashion. Open Hardware Monitor at least exposes its data as a JSON file. So even if I would like to write my own Prometheus exporter, it's way easier to do that with Open Hardware Monitor. Also, I do realize that doing this in such a way isn't 100% perfect or ideal. Even if I increase my polling rate on Prometheus, Home Assistant can still skip some data points because of its own long polling period. But still, for a hobby solution and my deployment at home and for fun, it's enough. So yeah, that's it. And after all of that being done, I think it's time for me to play some games.